14. The Earth itself. Long before anyone carved a needle or drilled a skull, the oldest medicine on the planet was dirt. Geophagy, the deliberate consumption and external application of clay and mineral-rich soil, may be the most ancient healing behavior in the human lineage. A study published by Carretero in 2002 through the journal Applied Clay Science compiled evidence suggesting that both Homo erectus and Neanderthals used clays for curing wounds, cleaning skin, and soothing digestive illness. The practice is so old it may predate the capacity for language. It almost certainly predates our species. The mechanism is not mystical. It is chemistry. Natural clays, particularly iron-rich smectites and montmorillonites, contain mineral ions that interact destructively with bacterial cell walls. In 2008, researchers at Arizona State University, led by geochemist Linda Williams, demonstrated that specific French green clays could eliminate methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus on contact. MRSA is one of the most dangerous antibiotic-resistant infections in modern hospitals. Patients die from it in sterile wards with access to every pharmaceutical compound available. Clay from a riverbank killed it in a laboratory dish. Ancient humans did not understand ion exchange or bacterial membrane disruption. They understood something far simpler, and arguably more important. They understood results. When you packed a wound with the right mud from the right source, the wound stopped festering. When you swallowed a particular clay after eating spoiled meat, the cramping eased and the diarrhea stopped. Observation. Repetition. Memory. Transmission to the next generation. The practice has never disappeared. Indigenous populations across every inhabited continent still use medicinal clay. In sub-Saharan Africa, pregnant women consume kaolin clay for mineral supplementation and nausea relief. In the 1st century, clay from the Greek island of Lemnos was so medically valued that its harvesting was supervised by a priestess. The Romans called it terra sigiata, stamped earth, and traded it across the Mediterranean. Hippocrates himself documented geophagy as a therapeutic practice, providing what is considered the first written record of medicinal earth consumption. Between Homo erectus packing a gash with riverbank clay and Hippocrates writing about it, roughly 1.5 million years of accumulated medical knowledge passed through human memory. None of it written down. All of it carried forward by people who understood, at a level that preceded formal thought, that the ground beneath their feet contained substances that could keep them alive. Would you trust mud to save your life? For most of human existence, that was the only option, and it worked far more often than it should have. Number 14. Blood and iron. Red ochre is iron oxide. It is one of the most common mineral pigments on the planet, and it has been found at human occupation sites dating back over 100,000 years. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists assumed its presence was decorative or symbolic, evidence of body painting, ritual marking, and the emergence of abstract thought. That interpretation was incomplete. Experimental analyses conducted over the past 2 decades have confirmed that ochre possesses measurable antibacterial and antifungal properties. The iron oxide content disrupts microbial cell function. When ground into a fine powder and mixed with fat or water into a paste, ochre produces a substance that can be applied directly to a wound as a protective, antiseptic coating. Researchers studying the use of ochre at Middle Stone Age sites across South Africa, including Blombos Cave and Rose Cottage Cave, have found grinding stones with striations and ochre residue deposits consistent with the deliberate production of paste, not pigment for walls, but ointment for skin. At Pork Epic Cave in Dire Dawa, Ethiopia, dated to approximately 40,000 years ago, researchers analyzed 21 ochre processing tools and over 200 ochre fragments concentrated in a specific area of the cave. The tools showed evidence of different processing techniques used to produce ochre powder of varying coarseness and color intensity. One rounded stone bore residue consistent with having been dipped into a liquid ochre medium, as though someone was using it to apply a paste to a surface, possibly a wound, possibly a hide, possibly both. Neanderthal sites across Europe from 100,000 years ago onward show similar evidence. Grinding stones at sites like Pech de la Zay in France bear ochre deposits and use-wear patterns indicating sustained processing. The quantities involved are larger than what decoration alone would require. These were production sites. The idea that early humans recognized the medicinal properties of iron-rich minerals before they developed any formal concept of infection or disease sounds counterintuitive. But the observation required no theory. Apply this red powder to a wound, and the wound heals faster. Skip it, and the wound gets worse. That is empirical medicine in its purest form, practiced by people who may not have known the word for infection but absolutely understood what it looked like. Modern surgeons apply iron-based compounds to surgical sites for the same reason. The chemistry has not changed in 100,000 years. Number 13. Thread made from tendons. Approximately 50,000 years ago, someone sitting in the dim interior of Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia carved a needle from bone. Not a crude awl, a needle, with an eye drilled through one end, small enough to thread a strand of animal sinew through it. In 2016, researchers at the Novosibirsk Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography, led by Maxim Kozlikin, published findings on this artifact. The needle measured roughly 7.6 centimeters in length. It had been polished to a smooth finish. The eye was precisely drilled, indicating a level of fine motor control and tool-making patience that would challenge most modern craftspeople working without magnification. This object is usually discussed in the context of clothing, fitted garments that sealed at the wrist, the ankle, and the neck. The technology that allowed humans to colonize the subarctic during the last glacial maximum. Ian Gilligan at the University of Sydney published a comprehensive analysis in 2019, arguing that the development of tailored clothing was the single most important technological breakthrough that allowed anatomically modern humans to survive above 50 degrees north latitude during peak glaciation. Without the needle, most of the northern hemisphere would have remained uninhabitable. However, the bone needle had a second function that rarely receives the attention it deserves. If you can sew leather, you can sew skin. If you can thread sinew through an eye and push it through a hide to create a sealed seam, you can do exactly the same thing to a laceration. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe and Siberia indicates that prehistoric humans made bone needles continuously for over 30,000 years. The same dried animal sinew used to stitch fitted garments served as surgical thread. The technique would have been functionally identical. Pull the edges of the wound together. Pierce the skin on one side. Push the needle through. Loop the sinew. Pierce the other side. Pull tight. Repeat. A deep laceration from a flint tool, a gash from a hunting accident, a torn scalp from a fall on frozen ground. Any of these could bleed a person to death in minutes without closure. The bone needle turned a fatal wound into a survivable one. It reduced the window of infection. It held tissue in place long enough for the body's own clotting mechanisms to stabilize the injury. The concept is so simple it barely registers as revolutionary. But consider what came before it. Before the needle, every deep cut was a potential death sentence. You could press a hide against the wound and hold it. You could pack it with clay or moss. But you could not close it. The needle closed it. Every suture used in every operating room in the world today is the descendant of sinew threaded through bone by someone whose name was never spoken aloud in any history class. Number 12. Treatment by fire. Fire has been part of human life for at least 400,000 years. And for much of that time, fire was not just warmth and cooking, it was medicine. Cauterization, the application of intense heat to a wound to stop bleeding, destroy damaged tissue, and seal the injury against contamination, is one of the oldest documented surgical techniques. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to approximately 1600 BCE but believed to record knowledge from centuries earlier, describes cauterization procedures for wound treatment. Hippocrates elevated the principle to a doctrine. Those diseases which medicines do not cure, iron cures. Those which iron cannot cure, fire cures. Those which fire cannot cure are to be reckoned wholly incurable. However, the practice is far older than any written text. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence reveals that peoples across Asia, the Americas, and Africa independently developed methods of using fire to treat wounds before any of their medical traditions were recorded. Some Asian tribes used mixtures of saltpeter and sulfur placed directly onto open wounds and ignited, creating a controlled chemical burn that cauterized the tissue. Indigenous peoples of the Dakota used hollowed feather quills attached to animal bladders to suck purulent material from infected wounds before applying heat to seal them. The principle was brutal in its simplicity. Fire kills everything it touches. That includes the bacteria colonizing an open wound. The reason cauterization worked, when it worked, is straightforward. Extreme heat denatures protein. It coagulates blood. It creates a layer of dead tissue, an eschar, that temporarily seals the wound against external contaminants. The pain was agonizing. The scarring was permanent. But in an environment where the alternative was sepsis and death, a cauterized wound was a wound that might heal. The technique survived in European medicine well into the Renaissance. Arab surgeons codified it extensively. Byzantine medical texts built on the Roman tradition of thermal wound treatment. And while modern medicine has replaced crude cauterization with electrocautery, laser ablation, and chemical hemostatic agents, the underlying principle remains identical. Controlled thermal energy applied to tissue to stop bleeding and prevent infection. The first person who pressed a heated stone against a bleeding wound and watched the bleeding stop did not understand protein denaturation. They understood that fire changed things. And in that observation, they found a way to keep someone alive who would otherwise have bled out on the ground of a cave or a forest clearing. The idea that our ancestors used the same force that cooked their food to cook their wounds is difficult to think about. But the archaeological record does not care about comfort, it cares about survival. Number 11. Setting the broken bone. A fractured femur is among the most dangerous injuries a human being can sustain. The femoral artery runs directly alongside the bone. A displaced fracture can sever it, causing death from blood loss within minutes. Even without arterial damage, the pain from a broken thigh bone is incapacitating. The victim cannot walk, cannot stand, cannot flee from predators, gather food, or reach shelter. Without intervention, a person with a fractured femur in a prehistoric environment was almost certainly going to die, not from the break itself, but from exposure, starvation, or predation during the weeks it takes the bone to heal. The archaeological record shows that many of them did not die. Healed femoral fractures appear in prehistoric skeletal remains from multiple continents and time periods, with bone callus formation indicating that the fracture stabilized, the fragments realigned at least partially, and new bone grew around the break over weeks or months. This process does not happen to a person lying unattended on open ground. Someone kept them alive, someone fed them, someone immobilized the limb. Remains of Neolithic humans show evidence of fractures splinted with what appears to be bark and sticks, secured with bandages made from plant fibers or rawhide. The Shoshone people of North America wrapped broken limbs in strips of fresh rawhide that had been soaked in water for days. As the rawhide dried, it contracted and hardened into a rigid cast, holding the bone in alignment without any manufactured material. The earliest physical evidence of formal splinting was discovered at Naga Eddur, roughly 100 miles north of Luxor in Egypt, by Professor G. Elliott Smith during the Hearst Egyptian expedition of the University of California in 1903. 2 specimens were recovered, both with splints still attached. One was an adolescent femur with a compound comminuted fracture splinted with 4 longitudinal wooden boards, each wrapped in linen bandages. A dressing pad containing blood pigment was found at approximately the level of the fracture site. The second specimen showed a forearm fracture treated with bark splints and linen wrapping. The design was remarkably sophisticated, bark-shaped to conform to the limb, padding to prevent pressure injury, and wrapping to hold the assembly firmly in place. These specimens date to the 5th dynasty of Egypt, approximately 2500 to 2350 BCE. However, the healed fractures found in far older skeletal material, long before any civilization built anything resembling a hospital, tell us that the knowledge of bone immobilization extends back thousands of years further, into a period where the only materials available were sticks, bark, mud, and the willingness to spend weeks caring for someone who could not care for themselves. The anthropologist Margaret Mead was once asked what she considered the first sign of civilization in an ancient culture. Her answer was not a tool, a pot, or a religious artifact. It was a healed femur. Because a healed femur means someone else stayed. Number 10. The wax that stopped the pain. In the collections of the Natural History Museum of Trieste, Italy, there is a partial human mandible that most visitors would walk past without a second glance. The jawbone holds a canine, 2 premolars, and the first 2 molars. The teeth are heavily worn, ground down from a lifetime of chewing coarse Neolithic grain. One of the teeth, the left canine, has a vertical crack running through its enamel and a section of exposed dentin on the chewing surface. In 2012, a research team led by Federico Bernardini at the Abdus Salam International Center for Theoretical Physics subjected the mandible to a battery of analyses: synchrotron radiation-computed microcourt, accelerator mass spectrometry radiocarbon dating, infrared spectroscopy, scanning electron microscopy. What emerged from the scans was a detail invisible to the naked eye. The crack in the exposed dentin had been filled with beeswax. The wax had been pressed into the fracture line and across the sensitive surface with enough precision to seal the exposed nerve channels running through the tooth's interior. Radiocarbon dating placed the beeswax at approximately 500 years old, contemporaneous with the tooth itself. If the filling was applied while the individual was alive, and the evidence strongly supports this interpretation, then it represents the earliest known direct evidence of therapeutic palliative dentistry in the world. The exposed dentin would have caused sharp, shooting pain every time the tooth contacted hot food, cold water, or sugar. The beeswax sealed those channels. The pain stopped. What makes this finding particularly revealing is what the rest of the jaw tells us. Other teeth in the mandible show identical wear patterns and exposed dentin. None of them were filled. This was not a ritual practice applied to all teeth after death. This was a targeted intervention on the one tooth that hurt the most. Someone looked at this person's mouth, identified the problem, and applied a solution specific to that problem. Prior to this discovery, the oldest evidence of dental work came from Mehrgarh in Pakistan, where drilled molars date back roughly 9,000 years. However, those cases involved drilling, a destructive procedure aimed at removing decay. The Slovenian beeswax filling is something different. It is constructive. It adds material rather than removing it. It is, in essence, the first filling in human history. Beeswax was widely available in Neolithic Europe. It was used as a binding agent, a sealant, and a waterproofing material. Someone made the cognitive leap that a substance used to seal containers could also be used to seal a tooth. That is medical reasoning. That is diagnosis followed by treatment, followed by a material solution engineered from available resources. Number 9. Drilled while alive. At the Neolithic site of Mehrgarh in the Balochistan province of what is now Pakistan, people began to settle along the Bolan River sometime around 7000 BCE. They were among the earliest farming communities in the Indus Valley, cultivating wheat and barley, breeding cattle, and crafting small beads from imported lapis lazuli, turquoise, and carnelian. They were skilled artisans. They were also, it turns out, dentists. In 2006, a landmark study published in the journal Nature by Andrea Coppa and colleagues analyzed 11 drilled molar crowns from 9 adult burials at Mehrgarh. The drilled teeth came from 4 women, 2 men, and 3 individuals of unknown sex, ranging in age from approximately 20 to over 40. Microscopic examination revealed precisely shaped circular holes in the enamel and dentin, consistent with marks produced by flint-tipped bow drills, the same rotary tools used at the site to bore holes through tiny beads. Concentric ridges inside the drill holes confirmed the rotational nature of the tool. The holes ranged in diameter up to 3.5 millimeters and in depth up to 3.5 millimeters. Several showed smoothing and edge wear that could only have developed while the tooth was still in a living mouth, exposed to chewing forces and saliva over time. These teeth were drilled in vivo. The patient survived the procedure. Researchers recreated the technique. Using a flint drill tip mounted in a rod and attached to a bowstring, they produced nearly identical holes in less than 1 minute. The speed is important. A faster procedure means less time for the patient to endure pain, less time for saliva and blood to contaminate the site, and a cleaner result. Roberto Macchiarelli, professor of paleoanthropology at the University of Poitiers and the study's lead anthropological researcher, attributed the dental problems to the Neolithic diet. The shift to cultivated grain introduced large quantities of abrasive mineral material from stone grinding surfaces. Teeth wore down rapidly. Dentin was exposed. Infection risk climbed. The drilling was a response to a problem that agriculture itself had created. What is perhaps most striking is the duration of the practice. The drill teeth at Mehrgar span approximately 500 years. This was not a one-time experiment. This was a sustained dental tradition, practiced across generations, refined and maintained by a community that valued the ability to treat oral pain. David Freyer, professor of anthropology at the University of Kansas and lead author of the Nature paper, emphasized this point. It was not just a sporadic event. After those 500 years, the practice vanished from Mehrgar. It did not reappear anywhere in the archaeological record until roughly 1100 CE among the Anasazi of the American Southwest, and not in Europe until approximately 1500 CE. An entire medical technique, proven effective, was lost for thousands of years. How much other knowledge disappeared the same way? Number 8. Jaws that never let go. In the tropical forests of South America, the savannas of East Africa, and the river valleys of the Indian subcontinent, ancient peoples independently arrived at the same extraordinary solution to wound closure. They used living insects. The earliest written record appears in India's Atharva Veda, dating to approximately 1000 BCE. The text describes using the mandibles of large ants to close wounds, including, remarkably, internal intestinal wounds during abdominal surgery. The physicians, Susruta and Charaka, foundational figures in ancient Indian medical tradition, refined the technique further. But the practice was almost certainly far older than any written account. Oral traditions in multiple cultures describe ant suturing as knowledge that existed before memory, inherited rather than invented. The method required precision, nerve, and a deep understanding of insect behavior. A healer would select army ants or driver ants, species whose mandibles evolved to dismember prey and defend colonies. These jaws are among the strongest relative to body size in the insect kingdom. They clamp with a force that, once engaged, does not release even after death. The ant was held carefully above the wound, mandibles positioned so they would bite across both edges of the laceration. The ant bit down. The healer then twisted or pinched the body away from the head. The ant's body came free. The head stayed, mandibles locked into the flesh on either side of the wound. Each severed head functioned as a biodegradable surgical staple. Multiple ant heads were placed along the length of the wound until it was fully sealed. The mandibles remained embedded for days, giving the tissue beneath them time to begin healing. When the wound had knit together sufficiently to hold itself, the mandibles eventually dried and fell away on their own. No removal procedure required. No secondary intervention. European explorers documented the practice throughout the Amazon basin during the 1800s. Indigenous peoples in East Africa used doorless driver ants for the same purpose. As late as 1896, Greek barbers were still closing minor wounds with ant heads. The practice persisted in rural India well into the early 20th century. Some researchers believe the formic acid present in ant saliva may have provided mild antimicrobial protection at the wound site, an unintentional antiseptic delivered by the staple itself. The primary benefit, though, was mechanical, wound closure, without thread, without needles, without any manufactured material at all. 3 continents, no contact between the cultures, the same solution. That is not coincidence. That is convergent medical engineering, driven by the same desperate problem: how do you close a wound when you have nothing to close it with? Answered by people smart enough to look at the world around them and repurpose what they found. You look at a creature whose jaws never let go and you think, that is exactly what I need. That is not primitive thinking. That is engineering under constraint. Number 7. The pharmacy and the teeth. In 2017, a research team led by Laura Weirich at the Australian Centre for Ancient DNA at the University of Adelaide published a study in the journal Nature that fundamentally altered how scientists understood Neanderthal cognition. The method was, in hindsight, elegant. They sequenced ancient DNA trapped in dental calculus, the hardened plaque that mineralizes on teeth over a lifetime, from 5 Neanderthal individuals excavated at 2 sites across Europe. 2 of the Neanderthals came from Spy Cave in Belgium. Their calculus contained DNA from woolly rhinoceros and wild sheep, confirming a heavily meat-based diet consistent with the cold, open landscape of glacial northern Europe. But the calculus from the Neanderthals at El Cidrón Cave in the Asturias region of northern Spain told a completely different story. Their diet was dominated by mushrooms, pine nuts, and moss, no meat at all. The two populations, separated by geography and ecology, had adapted their diets entirely to their environments. Then Weirich's team found something that made the dietary analysis secondary. One individual from El Cidrón, dating to between 350–600 years ago, had a visible dental abscess on his jawbone. Physically visible, even 50,000 years later. He was also infected with Enterocytozune bianusi, an intestinal parasite that causes severe diarrhea, vomiting, and abdominal pain. This Neanderthal was not just eating plants instead of meat. He was sick, visibly, painfully sick. His dental calculus contained DNA from poplar bark. Poplar contains salicylic acid, the compound that serves as the active ingredient in aspirin. It is a painkiller and a powerful anti-inflammatory. The same calculus contained genetic sequences from Penicillium rubens, the mold that naturally produces penicillin. Neither poplar nor penicillium appeared in the calculus of the other Neanderthals tested, only in the one who was sick. Earlier work had already pointed in this direction. In 2012, Karen Hardy of the Catalan Institution for Research in Advanced Studies, along with Stephen Buckley and Matthew Collins at the BioArch research facility at the University of York, applied pyrolysis gas chromatography mass spectrometry to dental calculus from 5 Neanderthals at El Cidrón. In the calculus of one individual designated adult 4, Hardy found azolines and coumarins, chemical compounds produced by yarrow and chamomile. Both are bitter-tasting plants with negligible nutritional value. Both have well-established anti-inflammatory and medicinal properties documented across human cultures worldwide. The convergence of evidence was difficult to argue with. This was not accidental ingestion. This was a Neanderthal with a painful abscess and an intestinal infection, who was consuming specific plants with specific pharmacological effects that directly addressed his specific symptoms. He was taking aspirin for the pain. He may have been consuming a natural antibiotic for the infection. Alan Cooper, then director of the Australian Centre for Ancient DNA, stated the conclusion without hedging. Neanderthals apparently possessed a good knowledge of medicinal plants and their various anti-inflammatory and pain-relieving properties, and seem to have been self-medicating. The use of antibiotics would be very surprising, as this is more than 40,000 years before we developed penicillin. We carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Their pharmaceutical knowledge was never written in any text. But it may have survived an instinct, in the impulse to reach for certain plants when the body hurts, an impulse older than our species itself. Number 6. The man who should not have lived. In 1957, American archaeologist Ralph Selecki excavated a skeleton from Shanidar Cave in the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan that defied every assumption about life in the Pleistocene. The individual, designated Shanidar I, was a Neanderthal male who had lived approximately 50,000 years ago. His injuries were not just severe, they were comprehensive. A crushing blow to the left side of his skull, sustained in childhood or early adulthood, had damaged his left eye socket, almost certainly blinding him on that side, and injured the brain region controlling the right side of his body. This neurological damage led to the withering and eventual loss of his right arm. Whether the arm was surgically amputated or atrophied to the point of uselessness and then removed, the bone had healed over long before his death. The stump was smooth, clean, old. His right leg showed multiple injuries. A healed fracture in a metatarsal bone of his right foot would have given him a severe chronic limp. Walking across uneven terrain, the only kind of terrain that existed in the Zagros foothills 50,000 years ago, would have been painful with every step. He also suffered from diffuse idiopathic skeletal hyperostosis, a degenerative condition that causes bone to form along the spine, producing muscular pain and reduced mobility. Then, in 2017, Eric Trinkhaus at Washington University in St. Louis and Sébastien Viot of the French National Center for Scientific Research published an analysis in PLOS One revealing something that previous examinations had missed. Bony growths inside Shanidar I's ear canals, auditory exostasis, would have caused profound hearing loss. This man was functionally deaf. Blind in one eye, deaf. One-armed. Walking with a painful limp. Suffering chronic spinal pain. In an environment where saber-toothed cats, cave hyenas, and wolves hunted actively. Where food had to be tracked, killed, butchered, and carried back to shelter. Where winter temperatures in the Zagros Mountains dropped well below freezing. Where survival demanded constant physical effort and acute sensory awareness. And he lived into his 40s. By Paleolithic standards, that was old age. The Smithsonian's Human Origins program estimates his age at death between 35 and 45 years, noting explicitly that he would probably not have been able to survive without the care of his social group. Trinkaus stated the conclusion with precision. More than his loss of a forearm, bad limp, and other injuries, his deafness would have made him easy prey for the ubiquitous carnivores in his environment, and dependent on other members of his social group for survival. Shanidar I did not heal himself. His group healed him. They fed him when he could not hunt. They protected him when he could not hear danger approaching. They guided him through terrain he could barely see and could not navigate alone. They kept him alive for decades despite the fact that, by any utilitarian calculus, he was a liability. He consumed resources he could not replace. He slowed the group. He required attention and labor that could have been directed elsewhere. And they did it anyway. This is not wound care in the narrow technical sense. This is something larger. This is evidence that 50,000 years ago, a species we once dismissed as dim, brutish cave dwellers had developed the foundational principle of all medicine. The principle that a life is worth preserving, even when preserving it offers no material return. That is compassion embedded in bone. Number 5. The first aid kit, frozen in ice. In September 1991, two German hikers named Helmut and Erika Simon were crossing the Ötztal Alps near the Italian-Austrian border when they noticed a shape emerging from a melting glacier at an elevation of roughly 210 meters. They assumed it was the body of a recently deceased mountaineer. Rescue teams were called. A body was extracted from the ice with a jackhammer and a ski pole, causing some damage to the remains in the process. The body did not belong to a modern mountaineer. It belonged to a man who had died approximately 300 years ago. He became known as Otzi the Iceman, and over the following 3 decades, his frozen remains would reveal one of the most complete pictures of prehistoric medical practice ever assembled. Otzi was not a healthy man. CT scans, DNA analysis, and radiographic imaging, conducted across multiple studies at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology, revealed a catalog of chronic conditions. Degenerative arthritis in his spine, knees and ankles, gallstones, hardened arteries, Lyme disease, confirmed through the detection of Borrelia burgdorferi, DNA, in a 2012 genomic study, making him the oldest documented case of the illness. Helicobacter pylori infection in his stomach, whipworm parasites in his intestines, and, finally, a flint arrowhead lodged beneath his left shoulder blade, the wound that ultimately killed him. However, the items he carried told a parallel story about how his community tried to keep him alive before that final arrow. Threaded onto leather strips among his equipment, researchers found 2 lumps of the birch polypore fungus, Piptoporus betulinus. This fungus contains polyporenic acid, a compound with verified antibiotic, anti-inflammatory, and styptic properties. It also kills whipworm. Otzi had whipworm. He was carrying the cure. In his stomach, researchers found bracken fern, a plant known to function as an antiparasitic. Traces of bog moss were found on the body, a material used across northern Europe for thousands of years as an antiseptic wound dressing. Archaeologist Patrick Hunt described the assembled collection as a deliberate prehistoric medical kit, not a random assortment of gathered material, but a curated selection of therapeutically active substances. Then there were the tattoos, 61 of them across his body, not decorative images. Simple groupings of lines and crosses, made by cutting the skin and rubbing charcoal into the incisions. They clustered at specific locations, his lower back, his knees, his ankles, his wrists, the exact points where his arthritis was worst. In 2018, Albert Zink and colleagues at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology published a study in the International Journal of Paleopathology examining the relationship between Ötzi's tattoos and his documented medical conditions. Their conclusion was striking. Roughly 80% of the tattoos aligned precisely with acupuncture meridians used in traditional Chinese medicine to treat chronic pain, back disorders, and abdominal conditions. The tattoos corresponded directly to sites of documented arthritis, chronic joint damage, and spinal degeneration. If the tattoos served a therapeutic function, this predates the earliest accepted evidence of acupuncture in China by at least 2,000 years. It also implies that Ötzi's community had developed a systematic mapping of the body's pain response points, an understanding sophisticated enough to identify, locate, and repeatedly treat specific areas with a consistent technique. Ötzi was murdered, shot in the back with an arrow while crossing a mountain pass. But the evidence preserved in his frozen body proves that the people around him had spent years, possibly decades, trying to keep him well. Fungus for his parasites, fern for his gut, moss for his wounds, charcoal under his skin for his chronic pain. This was not one healer improvising on the spot. This was a medical system. Number 4. Flowers for the dead, medicine for the living. In the 1950s and 1960s, Ralph Selecki's excavations at Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan produced 10 Neanderthal skeletons dating between 35,000 and 65,000 years ago. One of them, designated Shanidar 4, was buried with something that no one expected to find beside a Neanderthal body. Routine soil samples taken from around the skeleton for pollen analysis, originally intended to reconstruct the ancient climate and vegetation of the region, were analyzed 8 years after discovery by palynologist Arlette Leroy-Gourhan. In 2 samples, she found not just the scattered background pollen that drifts through any cave on the wind, she found whole clumps, dense concentrations of pollen from multiple species, suggesting that entire flowering plants, or at least their flowering heads, have been placed deliberately alongside the body. 20 plant species were represented in the general cave deposits, carried in by wind and animals over millennia. However, the species clustered around Shanidar 4 included yarrow, cornflower, bachelor's button, St. Barnaby's thistle, ragwort, grape hyacinth, a joint pine relative, and hollyhock. Every one of these plants has documented medicinal properties extending across cultures and centuries. Yarrow is an astringent, anti-inflammatory, and wound-sealing agent used to treat bleeding injuries across every continent where it grows. Its genus name, Achillea, derives from the mythological claim that Achilles used it to treat his soldiers' wounds at Troy. Cornflower is a diuretic and anti-inflammatory. Hollyhock soothes irritated tissue and has been used in folk medicine for respiratory and digestive ailments. Selecki proposed that Shanidar IV may have been a healer, a medicine figure whose knowledge of plants warranted a burial surrounded by the tools of the practice. The only Neanderthal among 10 at the site buried with flowers. The interpretation was romantic. It was also contested. In subsequent decades, researchers suggested that the pollen may have been introduced by animal activity, specifically by the Persian jerd, a burrowing rodent whose tunnels were found in the cave sediment near the burial. The jerd is known to cache plant material underground. The debate has continued for over 50 years. However, the broader body of evidence has moved decisively in favor of Neanderthal botanical knowledge, even if the specific case of Shanidar 4 remains disputed. Robert Power, a research associate at Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, who specializes in the diets of hunter-gatherers, analyzed dental calculus and residues from Neanderthal teeth and concluded that they clearly used plants such as chamomile, yarrow, and others for flavor and for medication. The Elcedron dental calculus evidence, published 5 years after the most recent challenge to the Shanidar flower burial, confirmed that Neanderthals consumed pharmacologically active plants in patterns consistent with targeted self-medication. Whether the flowers around Shanidar 4 were placed there by grieving hands or carried in by burrowing animals, the species themselves read like a prehistoric pharmacopoeia. Yarrow stops bleeding, chamomile reduces swelling, hollyhock coats and protects inflamed tissue. Ragwort, despite its toxicity in large doses, has been used in traditional medicine as an anti-inflammatory poultice. These are not subtle effects. They are the difference between a wound that closes and a wound that kills. And the people who understood these properties were doing so 60,000 years before the first pharmacy was built, the first prescription was written, or the first medical degree was conferred. If you could go back in time and visit the person buried at Darfur, what would you find? A Neanderthal who knew which plant stopped bleeding, which eased pain, which brought down swelling. A person whose knowledge was carried in memory, not in text, and whose death may have been marked by the same herbs they used to keep others alive. That possibility alone changes the story we tell about who our ancestors were. Number 3. Drilling into the living skull. At a burial site in France, dated to approximately 6500 BCE, archaeologists recovered 120 prehistoric skulls. 40 of them had holes. Not from violence, not from decay, not from the slow erosion of centuries in the earth. From surgery. Trepanation, the deliberate drilling, scraping, or cutting of a hole through the cranial vault, is the oldest surgical procedure for which direct physical evidence exists. The first confirmed case dates to roughly 7,000 years ago at Ensisheim, France, though Folke Henschen, a Swedish physician and historian, documented Soviet-era excavations along the Dnieper River from the 1970s that identified possible cases from the Mesolithic period, approximately 12,000 years ago. More than 1,500 trepanned skulls from the Neolithic period alone have been recovered across Europe, Siberia, China, and the Americas, representing between 5 and 10% of all cranial remains from that era. The procedure itself involved using sharpened flint, obsidian blades, or abrasive stones to cut, scrape, or bore through the skull bone until the dura mater, the tough membrane surrounding the brain, was exposed. Multiple techniques were used. Scraping was the oldest and most common, involving the gradual abrasion of bone in a circular area until it thinned enough to lift away. Grooving involved cutting a circular channel until a disc of bone could be pried out. Boring used a rotary tool, similar to the bow drills of Mergar, to penetrate the skull at a single point. The patient was conscious. There was no general anesthesia as we understand it. Evidence from Chalcolithic Bulgaria, specifically from the site of Tel Unat site, suggests that alcohol and possibly black henbane, a potent sedative plant documented in prehistoric Balkan contexts at the nearby site of Ilandensi, may have been used to dull the pain. But there is no definitive evidence of effective anesthesia before the 19th century. These patients felt the procedure. What should have been a death sentence was anything but. In French archaeological sites from the caves of Lozère and Seine-et-Oise, more than 70 to 80% of trepanned skulls show advanced signs of healing. Smooth, rounded bone regrowth around the surgical hole indicates that the patient survived for months or years after the operation. Some individuals underwent 2 and even 3 separate trepanations over the course of their lifetimes, meaning they survived the first surgery, developed or suffered another condition requiring it, and survived the second surgery as well. Then the third. In Peru, where the concentration of trepanned skulls exceeds all other regions on Earth combined, researchers David Kushner and colleagues at the University of Miami analyzed over 800 trepanned crania in a 2018 study. Between 400 and 200 BCE, the long-term survival rate sat at roughly 40%. By the period between 1000 and 1400 CE, the rate had climbed to between 78 and 91%. During the Inca period, 1400 to 1500 CE, the rate was between 75 and 83% out of 160 examined skulls. Compare that to the American Civil War. Union Army surgeons performing cranial operations with metal instruments, formal medical training, and manufactured surgical supplies achieved survival rates significantly lower than what Peruvian surgeons had reached centuries earlier, using sharpened obsidian and volcanic glass. The comparison is not a historical curiosity. It is a direct measurement of medical competence across time, and by that measurement, Stone Age surgeons outperformed trained doctors operating in the era of photography and telegraphs. The Kisii people of Kenya still practice a form of trepanation today, using basic tools in rural settings, with a documented survival rate of approximately 95%. The tradition has been passed down without interruption. Nobody fully agrees on why prehistoric peoples performed trepanation. Skull fracture treatment is the most widely supported explanation, particularly in cases where evidence of cranial trauma appears near the surgical site. Headaches, seizures, and conditions that may have been interpreted as spiritual afflictions are also proposed. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Prehistoric surgeons opened the skulls of living humans, exposed the brain's outer membrane to the open air, and the majority of their patients walked away from it. The cognitive neuroscientist Charles Gross estimated survival rates for prehistoric trepanation between 50 and 90%. Some patients lived years after the surgery. Their skulls prove it. The bone grew back around the hole. The tissue healed. They went on living. Could something like this happen again in our lifetime? A medical technique lost for centuries and then rediscovered. It already has. The antibiotics that Alexander Fleming stumbled onto in 1928 had been in use by Neanderthals 40,000 years earlier. We just did not know to look. Number 2. The oldest surgery on Earth. In 2020, during an archaeological excavation at Liang Tebo, a limestone cave in the remote mountains of East Kalimantan on the Indonesian half of the island of Borneo, a team of Australian and Indonesian researchers led by Tim Maloney of Griffith University uncovered a burial. The cave is accessible only by boat during certain times of the year. It contains some of the world's oldest known rock art, dating back at least 40,000 years. The walls are covered in hand stencils and paintings of wild cattle that predate anything found in the caves of France or Spain. The skeleton inside the burial was that of a young adult, positioned deliberately, dating to approximately 31,000 years before present. It was the oldest known burial of a modern human in island Southeast Asia. The preservation was remarkable. The left leg was incomplete. The distal third of the left tibia and the entire left fibula were absent. Not broken. Not decayed. Not gnawed away by scavengers. Cleanly absent, with the remaining bone showing clear evidence of remodeling, smooth rounded edges, and bony regrowth that only form when living tissue heals around a wound over a sustained period. This was not a birth defect, it was not an animal attack, it was not an accident. The clean margins and healing pattern were consistent with one explanation: surgical amputation. Melandri Vlok, a paleopathologist and bioarchaeologist at the University of Sydney and co-lead author of the study published in Nature in September 2022, confirmed the diagnosis. The bony growth patterns indicated that the amputation had been performed during childhood. The individual had then survived the procedure and lived for 6 to 9 years afterward, navigating the steep, densely forested mountains of interior Borneo on a single functional leg. This finding did not simply add a data point to the history of surgery, it obliterated the previous timeline. Before this discovery, the oldest confirmed surgical amputation was a 7,000-year-old case from Bouchier-Boulincourt in France, where a Neolithic farmer's left forearm had been surgically removed. The Borneo amputation pushed the evidence back by 24,000 years, from a settled agricultural community to a mobile hunter-gatherer group, from temperate Europe to equatorial Southeast Asia, from the Neolithic to the Upper Paleolithic. The environment matters enormously. Borneo's equatorial climate is hot and humid year-round. Average temperatures hover around 27 degrees Celsius with humidity regularly exceeding 80%. Open wounds in these conditions become colonized by tropical bacteria within hours. Infection is not a risk, it is a certainty. Modern surgical teams operating in tropical environments use broad-spectrum antibiotics, sterile instruments, and climate-controlled recovery wards, and post-surgical infection rates still remain a significant concern. The surgical team at Liang Tebo, whoever they were, did not simply remove a limb. They managed arterial bleeding in a child using stone tools. They prevented or treated post-surgical infection in one of the most microbiologically hostile environments on the planet. They provided sustained recovery care during a convalescence that must have lasted weeks or months. They kept the wound clean. They fed the patient, they carried them. And they did all of this roughly 20,000 years before the earliest known permanent settlements appeared anywhere in the world. Vlok stated the implication directly. The discovery implies that at least some modern human foraging groups in tropical Asia had developed sophisticated medical knowledge and skills long before the Neolithic farming transition. The conventional assumption has always been that complex medicine emerged alongside agriculture, urbanization, and organized society. Settled life created new health problems, the reasoning went, and those problems created the pressure to develop medical solutions. The Borneo amputation invalidates that narrative completely. Hunter-gatherers living in caves, moving through dense jungle, carrying everything they owned on their backs, performed surgery that the best European doctors could not reliably replicate until the discovery of antiseptics in the late 19th century. That is not a minor revision to the timeline. That is a 24,000-year correction. Number 1. Why they healed. Every method described in this video, the clay, the ochre, the needles, the fire, the splints, the wax, the ants, the drills, the fungi, the flowers, the trepanation, the amputation, each one is remarkable on its own. Together, they tell a story that the archaeological record can only partially capture, but that the evidence makes impossible to dismiss. Ancient humans did not stumble into medicine, they built it. Observation by observation, failure by failure, death by death, generation by generation. They assembled a body of knowledge so effective that it kept people alive through injuries that would challenge modern emergency departments. A child survived limb amputation in a tropical rainforest 31,000 years ago. A Neanderthal with a dental abscess selected the chemical precursor to aspirin and consumed it alongside an antibiotic mold 50,000 years ago. Prehistoric surgeons drilled holes in living skulls with sharpened stones and achieved survival rates that 19th-century European doctors, working with metal instruments and medical degrees, could not match. None of this was written down. Every scrap of it was carried in memory, taught by demonstration, learned through the irreversible consequences of getting it wrong. A healer who applied the wrong clay watched the wound fester and the patient die. A surgeon who cut too deep into the skull watched the brain swell through the opening. The knowledge that survived was knowledge tested against the hardest possible standard, whether the person lying in front of you lived or didn't. And the knowledge was shared, not hoarded, not locked behind institutional walls. It was given freely. Passed from healer to apprentice, from parent to child, from elder to student. Across thousands of generations. In languages that no longer exist, in communities whose names were never recorded. The entire edifice of prehistoric medicine was built on trust and memory. Trust that the person teaching you knew what they were doing. Memory that held precise botanical knowledge, anatomical understanding, and procedural technique without a single written word to anchor it. What makes this particularly haunting is what it reveals about the people we came from. We tend to imagine prehistoric life as short, brutal, and void of tenderness. The evidence contradicts that completely. Shanidar I, blind, deaf, and crippled, was kept alive for decades by people who gained nothing practical from his survival, except the knowledge that he was still there. The Borneo child was carried through a jungle on one leg by a community that could have left them behind. The person who packed a wound with ochre and waited. The person who threaded sinew through bone and closed a gash. The person who held an ant to a laceration and trusted its jaws to hold. The person who drilled through a skull and somehow, impossibly, saved a life. Each of these acts required not only knowledge but something deeper. The belief that another person's pain was worth trying to stop. The conviction that suffering should be met with action, not indifference. The understanding that what separates survival from extinction is not strength or speed or size, but the willingness of one individual to sit beside another in the dark and do whatever it takes to bring them through to morning. Modern medicine has antibiotics, anesthesia, imaging technology, sterile operating theaters, robotic surgery, gene therapy, and centuries of accumulated clinical data. The people in this video had stone, bone, plants, mud, fire, and each other. They healed anyway. Every hospital you have ever walked into, every stitch you have ever received, every pill you have ever swallowed for pain, every bandage you have ever wrapped around a wound, descends in an unbroken line from people who figured out how to keep each other alive in the dark. Before history. Before writing. Before anyone was there to record what they did, remember their names, or thank them for what they gave us. They did not just survive their wounds, they made survival possible for everyone who came after them. The bones remember what the books never recorded. And if you listen carefully enough, you can still hear what they are saying. We stayed, we tried, we healed. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.